Γεια σας. Hello. As I always say at the Gennadios Library, I never know what language to speak, and I always choose the wrong language, and I think this is the case here as well. But anyway, this is what it is. So, trained as a medievalist with a broad understanding of the interrelations between the arts of Byzantium, Islam, and the West, my current research interests have pulled me towards the art of the early modern period. Two separate moments in my academic life have contributed to this, and I would like to share them to you. A very long time ago, at the beginning of my research on my dissertation on the architecture of Venetian Crete, I was struck by a lively image of Kandiye, Ottoman Heraklion, in the Historical Museum of the city. A city view of the Megalo Castro details the port, the walls, the forts, minarets, and a fountain. According to the archives of the museum, it belonged to the Konaki of Fazil Bey and dates to the end of the 18th century or perhaps the beginning of the 19th. My fascination with the topography of the Venetian city of Candia meant that this image stuck in my head for decades. In accordance with all images drawn of the city from the late 15th century onwards, the Castello da Mar, or Cules, or Cules, I guess, towers over the ports and dominates the foreground. So my question was then, and it is, and now I'm sort of trying to get to it again, why would you have an image of your own sort of city in your home? And I assume because it was pride of place, Iskandiye is portrayed as an important city. Second point in my academic and professional life. More recently, at the Gennadios Library, when I started looking more carefully at the paintings of Dimitris Zographos, illustrating the memoirs for General Ioannis Makrigiannis, dating to 1836 to 39, I was perplexed by the way in which landscape and townscapes are treated by the artist. According to scholarship, this artist, who did not have any academic training, used an artistic idiom that hailed back to Byzantine art, especially to hagiography. There is, however, something incongruous about the tradition on which the Makrigiannis paintings are based, and it surely does not look very much like Byzantine art to me. The broader question that this project addresses is the afterlife of Byzantine art in the Ottoman period. One of the most interesting monuments of the artistic heritage of Greece from the Ottoman era is secular painting, namely frescoes in homes and mansions. I focus on non-ecclesiastical settings in the hope that art for the home would speak to issues of identity and community building in a more visceral manner than religious art, which is a public form of expression, and thus more conservative. Art for the church had to follow strict iconographic rules, and of course, part of these rules were written down in the period that when these houses were made. So at that time, these rules were written down in the famous Manual of Christian Art of Dionysius of Furna. And so it would be harder to pinpoint, if we were to look at Christian art, at sort of church ecclesiastical art, it would be harder to pinpoint the specific instances where the individuality of the artist or a communal identity would be evoked in the paintings. The domestic setting of the home provided a space that would speak to issues of prestige and self-representation, and the choices of subjects would be at the discretion of the patron, the person commissioning the work, according to the demands of fashion, social position, even in relation to political affiliations and aspirations. Of particular interest are the painted urban landscape that seem to link the imperial ambitions of the court in Istanbul or the professional goals of the rich merchants with cartographic searches of the cosmographers of the period, and I'll get to that. In the literature, The painting of the mansions of northern Greece has been studied typically within a local context, but thankfully many of the monuments have received, have been restored recently, so the time is ripe for a re-evaluation. The book by Miltos Garidis, Decorative Painting in the Balkans and Asia Minor from the 18th to the 19th century, published by Melissa in 1996, is a remarkable study of the material throughout the Balkans and Asia Minor. Starting from this book, my exploration focuses on some of the earliest surviving painting in order to investigate the mechanisms by which artistic practices and styles from the West, the East, and the Balkans fed one another. The project looks into a range of artistic and cultural pursuits by exploring issues of fashion, ideological quests and interactions, and seeks to appreciate if these constitute a distinct cultural artistic identity according to the new historical and national context of the period under formation. As I'm still at the very beginning of this project, which may become a research project for more than one person, today I will merely lay out some of the questions to open up a discussion. There are numerous studies of specific monuments and their paintings, but what I'm interested in here is the context within which such artistic endeavor lies. A very important question, of course, a very crucial question, is what is the relationship between the ecclesiastical painting on the time and secular art? Given that the vast majority of surviving works are ecclesiastical, studies have focused on influences and encounters between Western European art and Byzantine art. After all, a large number of new ideas, iconographies, and styles have entered the artistic life of the early modern Balkans through Crete and the Ionian Islands, as is evident in the religious icons produced there. Very few of the secular paintings are signed, so the first order of business is to match studied church cycles with the paintings from mansions. This, for those of you who know, is an immense task, and it's just a beginning. In trying to investigate the origins of this style, several perspectives can be broached. One is that of folk art. That is a traditional, non-academic style that can be found not only in Greece, but also in the rest of the Balkans. How can this idiom be best understood? Since it encompasses such a large geographical area, I believe that the term Ottoman offers maybe a useful perspective that opens up several significant questions regarding diffusion of styles, artistic mobility and fashion, not to mention ideological factors. And I want to let you know, of course you know that, those of you who were here yesterday, I thank the first presentation from yesterday that showed us these Isnik plates with Greek inscriptions on them. For all of my academic life, I've been fascinated by architectural illustration, so this is why this impressed me. In fact, the notion of Greek folk art or Greek folklore is very important for how we understand this art in relation to the Balkans. As a field, it came to substantiate the claims of continuity of the Greek people, and several of the areas that could not fit within the framework of history of art were relegated to the study of folklore. For the study of post-Byzantine painting, a discursive framework was established that considered the production of works in the provinces to the status of lesser or folk artists. As such, the paintings did not have to belong to any main art historical trends, but rather were a timeless, ingrown artistic form of expression that flowed from almost the inner psyche of Greek artisans. I have already suggested elsewhere that the notion of the vernacular should also inform our understanding of this phenomenon in Venetian Crete and other areas. There are nevertheless various ways in which this art, especially painting, secular painting, can be explored in the Balkans, including Greece and Turkey, to provide for a wider net of associations and to address larger questions about the formation of identity vis-à-vis stylistic choices. The project attempts to set the stage for a greater appreciation of the intricacies and complexities of diverse and either completing or complementary artistic expressions that made up the world of Ottoman art in the 18th century. And here I'm showing a house in Argyropoulos in Gjirokastër in Albania, which is a little bit later, but since I had my photographs from when we were there, I thought it was sort of important to just reiterate something that many of you know, that this sort of interior of the Ottoman house obviously is not we don't only find it in Greece. So one important avenue is the exploration of merchant networks. The economic crisis of the 17th century is reflected in the lower quality of the painting in several urban centers, Veria, Kastoria, Ochrida, and others. And it has been interpreted by the meager means of donors. It seems that merchants who lived in the mountain communities in the 16th and early 17th centuries managed to return to the cities of northern Greece by Epirus and Macedonia by the end of the 17th century, when they became the local elite. A close look at the artistic production of the end of the 17th century and the earlier 18th century would, I hope, offer important clues for the exchange of formal elements between East and West, Istanbul, the Balkans, the Ionian Islands, Italy, and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, Austria, Vienna, that is, Venice and Trieste. Here I'm showing a map from a major article on the merchants in the Balkans, sort of speaking about fairs and all of that. I'm sorry that I don't have a real map with the roads, but I'm sure you have a sense of where we are. It has also been proposed by Manolis Hatzidakis and has been studied further by Evgenia Georgopoulou, the fact that the economic crisis in Greece has meant that many of the painters moved to as far away territories as Romania and Albania, but also in Yugoslavia and in Bulgaria during the 18th century. Eventually, as we know, the merchants were organized in communities far from home. We know them very well: Vienna, Trieste, Venice, Livorno. And I wonder, as a person who has also lived abroad for many years, if the point of view of the diaspora helps or would help us as a concept for understanding what the Greek communities of merchants thought of themselves and how they wanted to present themselves in their homes. Oftentimes, belonging to the diaspora demands a definition of one's identity. It is they who talk about Greek versus other art forms, especially when it comes to decorate a church and to upkeep their Orthodox beliefs. Indeed, the Venetian community of Greeks in the end of the 16th century were particularly interested in safeguarding the true Greek art in their church. From the point of view of the study of high Ottoman art, provincial artistic endeavors hardly ever take center stage, so the monuments are not known outside the Balkans, that is to say, by scholars who are interested in the greater Ottoman world. I assume this is why I'm speaking in English, to address the crowds. I suggest that that we should not look at this art as a slavish imitation of the art of Constantinople, as these two slides would suggest, but obviously the similarities are very, very visible. But rather we should look at the art in the Balkans, especially in sort of secular art in the Balkans, as an attempt to find a middle ground between Ottoman, Greek, Balkan Orthodox, but also Latin Catholic visual expressions. This offers, I believe, a way to recognize diverse ethnic, religious, or confessional identities. The new book by Enver Rüstem, Ottoman Baroque, which came out a few months ago, provides a solid basis on which to think about these explorations. The crucial period is the early 18th century, when the influx of Western European printed materials, fashion, that starts with the tulip era, and the art seems to have a strong impact on Ottoman and post-Byzantine art alike. Aesthetic experimentation and cosmopolitanism were the qualities that were shared by high-ranking Muslims who directed the talents of the Demi artists who brought the Baroque style into Istanbul. For instance, the Nur Osmaniye Mosque was built by Simeon Kalfa and his chief assistant Cosma Kalfa, two Greeks. They were assisted by many Armenians and by many Muslims. Literate Ottomans with access to Ottoman prints and luxury goods surely recognized that many of the features of this new complex drew on Western models. Similar Baroque aesthetic permeates the painting of the mansions, but also the palaces in Istanbul, as we saw. At the same time, the icons produced in the Ionian Islands were also permeated by Western elements, while engravings of religious subjects offered new iconographic solutions that are altogether copied, almost secularizing the religious icons. The question that I would truly like to pose is whether the local elites in northern Greece were following trends in Istanbul and the European turn of the early mid-18th century, or if they were part of the network of communication for these ideas. After all, the Greek and other Balkan merchants canvassed the area of southeastern Europe from Austria and Trieste to Istanbul. There was surely communication, mobility, and visibility of the themes and the ways in which the rich houses were built and decorated. Yet I think it is quite clear that this notion of cosmopolitanism with decorative subjects and forms coming from different areas, I mean the wood ceilings, the paintings of flowers in vases on the walls, fireplaces with the very well-known hoods, and the addition of topographical views, but also some portraits, indicates that the patrons would also have had an influence on the choice of the subject matter. It is quite interesting to compare the city views that you see one from Asiatista, from the Archontico of Pulko, or Archontico Pulkidi. So it is quite interesting to compare the city views with the success of similar subjects, the success that similar subjects have had from the late 15th century and throughout the 16th century. And I only put an indication here of a view of Constantinople from a world chronicle printed in the late 15th century. But we know that these books were bestsellers. Like Breidenbach's Peregrinatio in Terram Sanctam or the Nuremberg Chronicle. So the decoration of these mansions, and here you see a view of Constantinople, which is quite fantastic and imaginary with wonderful clouds, far from only reproducing Istanbul practices, also participates in a dialogue with Italian, Austrian, and Western European paradigms of rooms filled with maps, and we know that there was one such very important room in the Palazzo Ducale in Venice, but also in the Vatican, also in villas in the Veneto, but also participating in a print culture, which is extremely important and which in the late 17th and early 18th century arrives forcefully in our territory. So these engravings probably had some very important role to play. Among the decorative patterns, as I already mentioned, are depictions of cities that play a very central role, and they're framed by decorative and geometric and floral patterns. There's a lot of color, which is very important. And it seems that like the landscapes of Western Europe, I mean, that are in this horizontal form in these printed books, the landscapes also in the mansions seem to actually almost invite the beholder to read them, to take a look at them. It is very interesting that the cities are normally not labeled. We don't know, I mean, Constantinople, we can normally sort of figure out what it is, but other cities are not labeled, so that's also something to keep in mind. But cityscapes seem to play an important role. Another very interesting architectural sort of feature that representation that comes into these homes is the representation of some sort of separate monuments, if you will, and I'm speaking about this, which is labeled, and we read to Vatopedi, and it's an image of the monastery, and then on the bottom you read Athonas. So images of monasteries, there's also a Paleospileo and other monasteries are also used in the context of the homes. One would imagine, and probably you know, that there is a connection or a pilgrimage or something with Mount Athos. And I wanted to juxtapose this with one of the paper icons, and this is what I was referring before about print culture. These things that were very, very cheap and very well, they were used almost by everyone. So one would imagine that it was part of the visual vocabulary that both the patrons but also the artists had to deal with. So the frescoes of the boats and the elaborate arabesques bespeak wealth and also of this sort of cosmopolitan disposition of the owners of the mansion. It is also very interesting to note that in the mid-19th century there are also images of Frankfurt, of Vienna. So to me it's very clear that it's the world of the merchants that you see on the walls. They have painted on the walls of their mansions. There is another sort of interesting point, and I'm coming to the end of what I have to say, the idea of the landscape not as a visual representation of a city, but as an image, as a decorative part, is also something that we see in some of the mansions. This is not very well preserved here, but the landscape is also part of this vocabulary that surely comes is spread in the West as well, and it's important to look at this. This particular room is also, I think, these particular paintings are also important for this idea of an art that is sort of more folk, maybe, or more not as naturalistic, and this is something to think about. So the standards that are followed are standards that exist in the whole of the Ottoman Empire, and this is what the basis is. So we see among the vases of these homes the Vatopedi monastery, we see landscapes, we see other views of towns, and the presence of even the ship the ships in the foreground indicate that there were choices and complex ways in which one could highlight one's position and status, even with limited skill, as we saw in this particular mansion. The local elites used as inspiration, as I mentioned, models that existed everywhere, both in East and West, as the two slides that I will show indicate. The illusionistic landscapes of the Felicity Gate at Topkapi Palace, as well as the landscape that work as framing devices in these very well-known costume books, these sort of portrait costumes of people, where you see the landscapes are come in, or sort of distinct monuments come in order to situate the persons who are depicted on the image. So the opportunities opening up to literate elites in this period are many. To the extent that style has a symbolic meaning, the mansions seem to be in between worlds due to the mobility of the circle of their owners, the cosmopolitanism which became a desideratum for the higher classes at this time, and the ensuing competition between foe and friend. These actors were paramount Ottoman subjects, and this is how we should view their homes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Maria, for